Hello, dear friends in Bulgaria and all over the world, and welcome. You are watching the TV show Visible and Invisible, Counter-Propaganda. I'm SVET DI-NAHUM. When the war sirens started in the early morning of February 24th this year, and Russia launched its malign full-scale war against Ukraine, a group of devoted people all over the world refused to sleep. They organized a 24-hour day and night broadcast on Twitter Spaces. It is called Mriya Report, providing detailed discussion, information, and expertise on the war developments. They also launched Mriya Aid, helping Ukraine with valuable supplies much needed every minute as we speak. In Ukrainian, Mriya means dream. So the people from Mriya Report and Mriya Aid organizations work continuously without a break to help Ukraine achieve its dream: freedom, sovereignty, independence, life, and dignity. And so today I am particularly proud and happy to talk to the co-founder of Mriya Aid organization, Mr. Alexander Bakus. Previously to the renewed invasion on February 24th this year, he has been an active Ukrainian-Canadian community leader and volunteer. Since the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014, he has served as the Vice President of Ukrainian National Federation in Ottawa, IT Lead Capital Ukrainian Festival, and organizer at Euromaidan, Ottawa. Since February 24th, he has worked to promote the cause of Ukraine via Mriya Report Twitter Space and founded Mriya Aid alongside members of Canadian Armed Forces to deliver aid that exponentially impacts Ukraine's frontline defenders. Mriya Aid has delivered over 3.5 million in aid through direct purchases, donations of equipment in kind, and fundraising through Mriya Report. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you, Svet. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Alex, let us start with the recent developments. You were included in the sanctions list of the Russian Federation. It is an honor, and it means that Mriya Aid is doing a lot for Ukraine. Could you please tell us a bit more about the activity of your organization?
Absolutely, and I think before we get on the sanctions list discussion, let's get to the interesting bit first. So, we just released our audit for the first 6 months of operations, and combined across all currencies, we raised just under 800,000 United States dollars with the help of our friends in Mriya Report. This also doesn't include our donations out of pocket across our team and corporate sponsorship. And so if we include all those details, our impact rises significantly to over 3.2 million in dollars in our first 6 months of operations. So this includes things like drones, individual first aid kits, medical aid that is both tactical medicine and humanitarian in nature, and other first responder gear like stretchers, hospital beds, medicines for hospitals, and even shoes for internally displaced persons. We had a company that was offering a donation of a lot of shoes. And this is something super unique about our organization and our not-for-profit, in that we not only procure equipment under the fundraised amounts, but also we reach out to organizations and work with them to donate their equipment and kit directly to Ukrainians in need. And it's both. We have the fundraising arm, and then we have the humanitarian aid arm, and they work in tandem, which basically multiplies our impact exponentially.
That's really impressive. And how does it feel now to be in the same sanctions list with along with Jim Carrey?
Let me be first to say that Jim Carrey is a childhood hero of mine. So I was glad that there was at least somewhere a list that him and I belong together. But let me start acknowledging the team here. Yes, my name is listed alongside another board member from our organization, and it's listed alongside amazing folks like Peter McKay, Jean Charest, Margaret Atwood, just to name a few. But it's only a reflection of our efforts across the whole organization. The fact that my name is there is just the symptom of how much impact Mriya Aid has delivered. And for that, I think both board members that are on there, we recognize that the Russian Federation's acknowledgement is important. Certainly landing on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs radar is a sign that we're moving in the right direction, despite them making a silly data entry error in transcription between Mriya Aid and Mriya Air. If you sort of look closely to the sanctions list, we're listed as members of an organization called Mriya Air instead of Aid. And to us, as a team, this is just another simple sign, yet again, that Russians have this attitude of flying by the seat of their pants and not delivering any quality. How they do anything is how they do everything. And quickly, without care, and without any attention to detail. And I think this isn't something new, right? I believe historically the word bistrot, the French word bistrot, which means fast food, was ostensibly the only word that was adopted by the French from the Russians who invaded Paris. And it was only because they continuously heard these commands to Russian soldiers to eat quickly, bыстро, быстро, быстро. And so this is how they do everything, fast to this day and without any quality or care.
Yeah, I remember very well somebody replying to their typo, and it was official document by the Ministry of International Affairs of the Russian Federation, and somebody wrote on Twitter, can't they just do anything right, even when they write sanctions list? I mean, it was quite ridiculous.
I have the perfect cop-out, if I'm ever in trouble, physically or practically with this sanctions list, I will say that I was never a board member of Mriya Air, and in fact, there was never such organization. So I have an easy out. They are a process-driven culture, and if something is wrong on the official document, it's something wrong. This is not my fault.
Absolutely. Just very recently, the good news were that the NATO Parliamentary Assembly adopted a document declaring Russia as a terrorist state. In view of that, what do you think? Should Russia be allowed at all to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council?
I think it's a really interesting question. And I think given the official recognition by NATO, now we're moving into the United Nations, I would like to sort of defer this to the absolute mastery and sort of performance of Serhiy Olehovich Kisleta, the ambassador and permanent representative of Ukraine to the UN, where he quotes that no country has ever voted for the ascension of the Russian Federation to the United Nations at all, not even just the Security Council. And it perhaps that all of the votes and records are inappropriate, that of a successor to the USSR. And I think every single country that has dissolved from the USSR rejoined on an official basis to the United Nations, except for Russia. And the seat belongs to USSR. And as we all know, USSR is not just Russia, it's many other countries. And so, is it legally still appropriate to even consider their seats to be valid? I think it's a difficult challenge to be had, But it's an interesting one. It will be interesting to see how this narrative and how this story continues. Do we allow this, or is the recognition from NATO a first step to taking away that credibility and that mistake to allow Russia to sort of succeed in place of USSR?
Absolutely. And here I would also like to add briefly that I'm very, very impressed by the work of Ambassador Sergei Kislitsa. I've been watching all his statements in the United Nations, and yeah, a great Ukrainian patriot, and I would say a diplomat of international capability who is doing everything possible to defend his country. So you have been...
Yeah, Sven, let me just sort of jump off from that point. I think we've seen a lot of that in the recent sort of 8 years of development. That finally Ukraine is showing, and Ukrainian politicians and bureaucrats and folks who are sort of rising to the challenge to show Ukraine. They are showing professionalism. They are showing great mastery of their work, and they're showing a lot of quality in terms of how they approach their work. And there's a lot of folks on a lot of different sort of platforms that we see internationally. And for a lot of people, it's a surprise. For a lot of people, it's a brand new, oh, these Ukrainians, they look like they know what they're doing. They can speak the English, and they have good mastery of and knowledge of the different topics at hand. And for me, it's finally a recognition that I always knew as Ukrainian, as born in Ukraine, that I always knew that our people had lots to show and lots to deliver, and lots of value to add to the world. And I'm finally glad to see that recognition happening on an international stage.
Yes, 100%. You have been long involved with the Ukrainian cause for freedom. That's why my next question would be, was the Russian danger underestimated by the West over the last 2 decades? Should the occupation of Crimea in 2014 have been the final red lamp? And was the world too easy on Russia after 2014?
Let me first start with my history of sort of involvement in Ukraine, and we'll talk a little bit about the Crimean invasion and the annexation and the invasion of Ukraine in the Donbass in 2015 or so. So, in a strange twist of fate, my grandmother's brother was in the Gulag. His name is Omelian Rosul. He was arrested and sent to Siberian prisons for 15 years. Yeah. And he stayed there nearly the full term. He was released early because they were finally letting dissidents. The Stalinist regime changed, and they were kind of letting people go and hoping for the best, that people wouldn't turn against the Soviet Union. And so sort of the Ukrainian cause, culture, language has been in my blood since birth. We all knew about his story, about him being in the Gulag, about the suffering that he endured. We have a deeper story about my grandmother's 2 older brothers running away from the Soviets through Austria, through the Czech Republic, and ending up as immigrants in the United States, in Ohio. There's a long bevy of history of cultural sort of struggle that we endured as a family. And so for me, it's in the milk, so to say, and there's no other choice. I just continue the legacy of my family, and this is a really touching moment. My grandma's still with us, thankfully. And when she heard the news about me being on the sanction list, she was absolutely elated. And she was so happy knowing that her father and her brothers all carried on the same cause, and I continue the family tradition. So
that's fascinating
that's
story. Yeah.
About me being, it's about me being part of the cause, and I think my children are gonna. I hope my children get to carry that on as well. So it's a very long history, much more longer than 20 years. Sadly, I'm not as young as I used to be, but it's a longer history for all of Ukraine. And here we go into, we can sort of dive into the invasion in 2014 and the annexation. And I think the whole world continues to underestimate Russia, and largely, the Western world, even to the very last moments of February 24th, 2022. I think the same could also be said about underestimating Ukraine. And we see this in all the narratives and the stories about, even the defense secretary saying, oh no, Kyiv is going to be taken in 3 days and 72 hours. And we see the rise of the Ukrainian resistance. We see the rise of the fight and the folks ready to stand their ground. And this story continues on, and it continues on for 500 years. So it's not just 20 years. We keep standing our ground, and we keep defending our existence as a people and as a culture. But let's zoom in, short term, let's zoom in on what happens with Crimea. Should it have been a sign? And I think largely the Putin regime is a great study of history. And they know, just as World War II Germany acted in incremental matters. They first invaded certain sections. They didn't start a total war. It was little bite sizes, right? And it's a lot easier. It's always a little bit easier to just freeze things, to not overreact, to not send a large, overwhelming force because you may be wrong. It's just human nature. I think it's just regular human nature that nobody actually wants a full total war with anybody. And this just means that Russia continuously gets to eat away at its neighbors, right? This isn't just Ukraine. In 2008, Georgia. Before that, it was the Chechen wars. Before that, it was Abkhazia and South Ossetia, in Georgia. There's lots of these little micro, we could call them micro, but they're really macro aggressions. They're just not total war aggressions. That people in other countries and other superpowers, they tend to not overreact on because nobody wants a total war, right? And I think this is the same issue now. I think Crimea was large enough for the world to take more attention and pay, that to me, it was a signal. I was actually in Ukraine in February of 2014, and we were watching this live on TV. And my wife, my kids, my family, we were all just it was a TV show, right? And it became really quickly real when the helicopters sort of crossed over into the peninsula and started to drop off these little green men. And to me, that was, okay, this is it. This is a war. I have a good feeling of how this is going to go, right? And when they invaded the Donbass region, again, they're taking advantage of a situation where there's a change of government happening, a democratic change of government happening, people voicing their dissatisfaction, and then going through the process of the sort of institutional and constitutional process to change that government and change the direction of that government. But there is a little bit of chaos in process, and they're taking advantage of that slight disorder. And to me, yes, as a Ukrainian, this was a big sign. But fundamentally, there's a ton of people who wouldn't even be able to put, their finger on the map and say this is Ukraine in the West, right? And I was speaking to a friend of mine last Friday, and he's from Holland, and he was telling me how surprisingly interested in the Kherson geography he became in the last couple of weeks just by reading the news and understanding all the different places, right? And I think the more we get to know Ukraine, the more we experience these trials and tribulations that Ukraine is telling us about and showing us, the more the West is going to feel that there's a need to sort of stand up for the values that we preach here in the West for the rest of the world. And I think now, sadly, because it's taking a lot of lives, now the world is treating it in the sort of correct fashion as it should be.
Exactly.
Should have been more aid in 2014, perhaps, but we can never change history, right? We can't go back.
We all see Ukrainian heroism, but instead of just sitting and watching and expecting all the miracles to happen quickly, do you think a point might come in which NATO shall be forced to intervene in some way?
I think it's a general question that is, assumes that NATO is not involved or not intervening at some points, right? And there's a very clear line that NATO has taken that, we're not sending our troops or our, bodies or boots on the ground to Ukraine. I think it's a very careful line. It's understandable. It means, because as a people in the West, we're more individual leaning. Therefore, we care about people's lives, and that delineation makes more sense, right? But NATO is involved, and NATO is interfering from a perspective of giving metal, giving armor, giving equipment and kit, and giving training. So there's already a sort of involvement. We can sort of call it an involvement and stay clear from the word intervention, right? To make it a little bit more interesting, is there a point where NATO might intervene, as in break their red line of no humans or no individual soldiers, in Ukraine and doing the fighting? I think it has to be a very, very deep incursion of a red line that is broken by Russia. And I think we see this reaction in the latest incident where, was still fully unresolved, still no conclusions yet made, but we do know that a rocket flew, and the consequences of that rocket flying, of that Russian rocket flying, ended up hurting 2 people in Poland, and there's lots of unresolved conclusions from that, whether it's the air defense from Ukraine that flew and intercepted, or it's the Russian rockets themselves. But we see that reaction, and the hesitation is again similar to what we talked about in Crimea, is that nobody wants a total war. So because nobody wants a total war, there has to be a very deep I think, my understanding of it is that Russia has to cross a very deep red line in order for NATO to sort of say, okay, we're sending our troops, we're sending our individuals and bodies and operators to put a stop to this. But so far, the Ukrainians themselves continuously say that they do not need more bodies. They can finish the job. They need more kit, and they need specific kit, and they need specific equipment in order to help them expedite the finishing of the job. And we've seen this over and over, time and again, in the Sumy region, in the Kharkiv region, in the Kherson region. We see this, that as soon as Ukrainians start advancing and they break through a certain line, the Russians just keep retreating, and there is no retribution on a military perspective. There's retribution and cost to it on a civilian perspective, because that's why NATO recognized Russia to be a terrorist state. They keep launching rockets on the civilian infrastructure. But on a military basis, they run away, and there is no retribution in that perspective. So they'll keep running away. And we know this. It's a pattern. It's an established truth now in how they conduct war. Okay, that's very, very interesting and fascinating approach on your behalf. And in respect to that, is there something that the West is still not doing? Is the military aid sufficient enough? Is there any chance for something more decisive, like finally closing Ukrainian airspace or providing Ukraine with attacking capabilities? Because it is obvious now that Russian army is going to the trenches for indefinite period. Yeah, I think a couple of things to think about in this perspective, and I'm only relaying the sort of knowledge and the firsthand testimony that I see on soldiers who speak to us, and soldiers who share this information freely publicly on video platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and on Twitter, right? But what we see, the general sort of idea here is, I'm going to just talk about the trenches and the winter war first, and then we're gonna go into the sort of, can the West do more? And the short answer is, of course, the West can do more. But let's go back to this sort of trenches and entrenchment of this issue. A ton of Ukrainian sort of capability is, I think the word is kolisne, which means it's tire based, as in or wheel based, right? So their movement, the troop movements, are based on wheels and tires, and so Ukrainians will get a large advantage when the ground fully freezes over, and they won't get bogged down in the dirt and in the mud, and they can start advancing. The Russians know this. This is why they're so heavy. They have their equipment is more track based, so it can go through mud and go through some of the wet ground conditions. And so that's why they're pushing for a really, they're trying to do these counteroffensive measures at the moment, because they want to at least get somewhere and get a little bit of headway during these wet conditions and sort of a soft ground condition, right? Ukrainians are waiting for the ground to freeze. It's going to freeze, and then it's all open season for Ukrainians on the trenches. And I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, because again, each time we've seen that as Ukrainians get to a state where they're able to push the artillery and push the metal of Russians further away from the front line, all the sort of bodies that are in the trenches, they run away. They leave all their positions, and they're scared. They're not motivated to fight, and they're not motivated to die, right? And so if we add in another additional layer of the mobilization that happened in the fall, and that is happening in these folks being severely undertrained, that adds another layer of Russians running away, and quicker and faster. And we see this in all the videos where, you'll have 2 guys or 3 guys in a tank, and one will start running away, and shortly, 2 minutes later, the other 2, and they will run in different directions just because of how chaotic things are. And that tells you that they don't have a plan. Again, quickly, without quality, same pattern. How you do anything is how you do everything, right? And so let's circle back about, what is there something that the West is still not doing? I think, I will defer here to all the sort of official statements that came from Ukraine that, suggest that the West is really just giving enough for Ukrainians not to lose. And Ukrainians have found a way to use that and keep winning, right? And so I'm not sure what the official total count is of the HIMARS systems, in Ukraine, but for a while they only had, I think it was like 16 or 18 units, and this is how they succeeded in the Kharkiv region. You know, imagine what Ukrainians would be able to do if they had 100 units, you know, or 200 units of the same HIMARS systems across the front line, right? And I think the front line now is 900 kilometers in the southern sort of theater. And like, imagine if they could create that 80-kilometer barrier on all of those 900 kilometers, right? It would basically free up everything up until Crimea really quickly and within short order. I think this is the bit about, you know, Ukrainians keep winning despite having very little equipment to win, right? And this is something that was underlined by a recent interview by President Zelensky, sort of saying that it is a 10-to-1 ratio of, you know, in terms of the capability and even loss. So for every single Ukrainian soldier that perishes, there's at least 10 Russians that perish in return. And even in the force capability in terms of the amount of ammunition and the amount of armor, it's still the same sort of ratio holds. And so if you think about multiplying that ability, giving Ukrainians more of what they're asking for, specifically in regards to protecting the sky, you know, we can call it closing the sky, but it's really just protecting the sky, and more capability to do sort of distanced and move the front line away from the southern theater. I think Ukrainians would, you know, I believe, and we've seen this, that Ukrainians will do a great job at pushing the Russian occupiers away. In terms of closing the airspace, I think I want to delineate and sort of differentiate a little bit about the history of this narrative, right? In March, when Ukrainians were talking about closing space, they were specifically asking or potentially requesting NATO to, you know, use fighter jets and do something similar to what, you know, Yugoslavia received in the 90s, as in that this airspace was closed off to any sort of air attacks or bombing by the various actors in the war in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia. I think that was a non-starter, and that involves direct NATO intervention. We spoke about that earlier, and I think there's a massive hesitation to do that, and I agree in this regard. It would certainly escalate things to an unnecessary degree. But then the story changed. Ukrainians stopped asking for direct involvement. They simply said, "Give us the jets," right? And there was even a whole bunch of things with Poland. You know, is it going to be transferred? Are they not going to be transferred? It still remains an open question. Right. And here, I think I'd like to defer to Taras Chmut. He's the head of Come Back Alive, and he's a fantastic analyst and sort of military, systemic military analyst. And he spoke about this from a perspective of what's going to happen to the aviation in Ukraine in the future. Right. And he specifically said, all right, the MiGs and the Soyuz, you know, the Soviet and Russian technology, that's going to die. It's going to go away. And so we, as a country, are going to re-platform in Ukraine to something, right? Whatever it is, it's not going to be MiGs and Soyuz. It's going to be something that the West has. And the best platform and the most accessible platform and the one that has the most training and the most amount of equipment and the amount of missile systems and the stuff that a lot of the Ukrainian Air Force has already been trained on are the F platform, the F-16s and F-18s. And it's only a matter of time before the rest of the Air Force in Ukraine has to transition to it. So we might as well start doing it now, and we might as well start adopting this technology because it's the future anyway. So we have to get that. And I think that's the largest sort of barrier. It's a mental sort of block. It's a mental barrier that I think the West, sort of Lockheed Martin and company, haven't crossed into thinking that, you know, despite the fact that Ukrainian Air Force is still flying MiGs and Soyuz, they're going to need a new platform, and it's going to be most likely the F fighter platform from the NATO countries. And lo and behold, there's a lot of them out there, and there's a lot of them out there that can just be sort of loaned or given to Ukraine, and the training isn't missing. You know, there have been a few cohorts of pilots, and the most famous one is, you know, his call sign is Juice. He trained in California. And you know, he trained as in his squadron. It's not him alone. A group of pilots with him trained on the F fighter platform, and I think it's just a matter of time before that actually gets turned on. But at what point is that going to be an official announcement? You know, remains to be seen. And I think there's a big difference between closing the sky between active sort of pilots, operators on the ground, versus giving equipment and enabling Ukrainians to use that equipment. And I think it's just, you know, if Ukrainians had more air defense and had the F platform, again, it's just like it's like receiving another 100 HIMARS instead of 16 or 18. You know, it would be quickly utilized to its full capacity.
Okay. We are moving to wrapping up. I have two more questions. Do you expect any negative change in U.S. policy toward Ukraine in January next year, when the new Congress shall be summoned? This is after the midterms, the results of the midterms, I mean.
I think short term, perhaps, there's something to be said about that. I think certainly Ukrainians have to consider the internal politics and the sort of cultural shifts in the United States. But as a people, United States loves to support others who are winning. And I think this is the bigger argument here and the bigger cause, right? In that, you know, after even if there's going to be some reshuffling and things happen on a sort of January, 30 days in January and another 24 to 26 days in February, after that, when things sort of settle and the chips will fall where they may, Ukrainians are going to continue showing results and showing positive winning to Americans. And as a people, Americans will support that regardless of their stripe, regardless if they're red or blue. So I think that's going to continue on. And from a political perspective, I think it almost doesn't matter. You know, Americans are ready for a fight, and they like the winning cause, whether they're red or blue.
I also hope so. I really hope for the best, that nothing changes in policy, and I hope there will be an increase of support, which regardless of internal U.S. politics, because this is the century-old chance for Ukraine to finally solve this issue with Russian occupiers and get rid of them once for all. And also it will be a victory for the whole free world, for all of us. So I sincerely hope nothing changes in US policy. Moreover, it's obvious more should be done. And here we move to our final question, because, you know, I'm also a writer, and for me, human suffering is the most terrible experience. And for how long the world will sit and watch Russian genocide over Ukrainians performed in the middle of Europe in the 21st century? I mean, in February, there was Oscars ceremony without official mentioning of the war, except for a few actors who did it. Right now, the world is watching football, soccer, you name it, and FIFA officials are not mentioning anything about Ukraine. They are not mentioning Iranian protests also. So the biggest drama was the beer issue. So my question is, have we lost the ability to empathize?
It's a great question, and I think the world is far more complex and interesting in this regard. And it just goes to show, right? So it's not a theory about the world; it's just how the world is. And if we sort of step back and take a look at how the world is, we see that the world cannot just be a single issue topic. And as humans, it's hard to sort of continue a narrative of suffering and continue a narrative of anger and fear. It's not a one-story situation. And as much as it pains me that, you know, FIFA, it doesn't talk about Iran and Ukraine, I also understand it. First of all, FIFA is problematic, just to start with, right? Lots of corruption, lots of issues with governance and management of FIFA. So for them to get into a political discussion, it's a non-starter for me, because a lot of that corruption comes from, you know, the dollars that fund FIFA. And a lot of those dollars and euros and yuans and any world currencies,
exactly.
You know, they get to tell FIFA about what they want to hear and what they don't want to hear, right? And so, it just as the baseline, we cannot expect FIFA to be coming out and talking about important challenges to the world politics, because you know, they ostensibly have an interest in making sure that people get along, right? And they hide behind this idea of the beauty of sport and the beautiful game of football. But, you know, we know fully well that football is very political, and it can be used as a political measure, and perhaps it should be more leaned on in this regard. But here we are. This is just how the world is, right? In terms of, have we lost the ability to empathize? I think no. I think contrary to that. And the story becomes very localized. We have a rapid reaction brigade that we've been helping, that we've known. You know, their number is 3018 RRB. We've been helping them since before the war started, and they were one of the first units that we helped with as soon as we organized Mriya Aid. And we recently, you know, a week and a half ago, one of the main intermediaries who procures equipment on their behalf and finds out what they need, she decided to run a little fundraiser through Mriya Aid, and we had the fastest. You know, I think we raised over 30,000 United States dollars in a span of in less than 72 hours, right? And I think, in fact, I think the whole fundraiser was finished by 48 hours. We just had to finish running the numbers in 3 days. That's how fast it was, right? And for us, you know, it doesn't sound like a large amount, but relatively, when we were buying 8 drones, we were raising 100,000. That took us over a month to do for our organization in sort of August. And so to have, you know, a third of that amount, slightly more than a third of that amount happen in 2 days, just tells me that the empathy and the people's commitment and people's involvement in the story, it rises with the times. And I think the more we notice that organizations like FIFA and Oscars, the more we want to hear the Ukrainian story and the war and the impact it's having on people, the more it shows empathy. It's a symptom, because we are aware that that story is missing from that event or that narrative. And we are seeking out that story. If we didn't care, if we didn't have the empathy, we would have just missed it. It would have just, you know, if it doesn't exist, there's nothing to miss, right? But the fact that we know that it should exist tells us that we are more empathetic. So to me, in that regard, lots of things, you know, the world is complex. lots of stories, lots of narratives. Certainly Ukraine is one of the top events and things that are happening in the world right now. But we have to support other things, right? And people need joy and jubilation, and sport provides that, right? And I think it's a healthy moment for engaging in sport. It's not healthy that FIFA doesn't mention us, but we know they don't mention us, and that creates a bigger story.
Okay, I'm glad you're optimistic, and I'm sure that with people like you and your organization and similar organizations that really care about what is going on right now, and with people who want to withstand and to fight evil here and now, the cause of freedom is not lost. So, Alex, I immensely appreciated it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, SVET. It was a pleasure, and what a fantastic show you've got.
Thank you. We'll continue. Thank you, Alex.
Cheers.
Yeah. This has been my exclusive and fascinating interview with Alexander Bakus from Mriya Aid organization. I'm looking forward to continuing interviewing Mriya Report, Mriya Aid members from all over the world and from other similar organizations, all who care about Ukraine and the cause of freedom and the free world. I thank you all for being together tonight with Visible and Invisible Counter-Propaganda with me, SVET DI-NAHUM. I will see you next week. Until then, you may like, follow, and share our Visible and Invisible Facebook page, follow me on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or support us on Patreon. Thank you all. Stay cool as usual. Have a good one.